Welcome to MedTech Speed to Data, a KeyTech podcast. I'm your host, Andy Rogers, VP of Business Development at KeyTech. Each month, me and a KeyTecher are going to interview a MedTech leader and talk to them about the critical data-driven decisions they make in their programs. Hey everybody, welcome back to MedTech Speed to Data. I'm your host, Andy Rogers from KeyTech, episode 22. Here we go. We've got Venk Varadan, CEO of Nanowear. Venk, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Andy and KeyTech, for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah, very excited to have you here. And as we were talking in our show prep, definitely want to understand the whole picture of Venk here before we get into Nanowear. You are a Renaissance man, as I can tell. Biomedical engineering and business, and it sounds like you're involved in the arts in New York City, which is super cool. You were a movie producer, if I'm not mistaken. I haven't watched the movie, but the movie An American in Hollywood. Maybe if you're listening, check it out. But can you tell us a little bit about that movie producer experience?
Probably the biggest, and it'll sound strange as a MedTech and digital health CEO, but probably my best prep for a first-time founder and CEO was producing films. My twin brother is an NYU film grad, and when we left high school and I went off to science and engineering and chemistry, he went to NYU and majored in film and visual arts. So as I started my career and he started his career, we would work our separate jobs, but do his productions on the side as standard independent filmmakers, or independent films are very much like startups in that regard. So we produced. He was the writer director, and I would produce. So just managing the budget, the schedule, all the stuff that the creatives are not necessarily great at, or even if they have to focus on, they're kind of taking away from their craft. So if he needed a light in a certain position and he needed the restaurant between midnight and 4, that's me kind of negotiating that. So we produced a short film in 2005 that world premiered at Tribeca Film Festival, and then the first feature was An American in Hollywood. It was loosely based on my twin brother Cy growing up in the film world in New York, getting trained in New York, and then moving out to LA with several of his friends to try and break into the industry. So it was kind of the minority version of Entourage, except they don't make it.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was kind of thinking. It kind of reminded me of Entourage, but KeyTech's here in Baltimore, and it seemed like two of the lead actors were from the HBO series The Wire. So I was impressed. So definitely going to watch the video or the movie.
Yeah, it's on all the streaming services, and JD and Hassan, both from The Wire, are still really good friends to me and my brother and our former staff. My brother's still running the company. It's called V Twins Productions, not surprisingly, and they were fantastic to work with. It was a really, really great experience. But as I mentioned, I think a good proxy. We launched that in 2014. I started Nanowear in sort of late 2014, which we'll get into, but is also a little bit of a family affair. But really, really good prep in that regard. So while I am a first-time founder and CEO, I think there's a lot of lessons you can pick up from being a film producer. So while they sound divergent and more of a Renaissance history, as you say, there are a lot of parallels.
Yeah, I would say dealing with personalities and trying to hit deadlines is probably the first couple of thoughts that come to mind. But the other thought that comes to mind to me is, you really do need to be a storyteller. And I pretend to be a storyteller here on Speed to Data on the podcast. But, I know as CEO of Nanowear and your product SimpleSense, you have to tell that story, and doing the research, and I want to get into it here. It seems like that story evolves depending on where you are in development, which aligns very well with our speed to data thinking, which is at the outset, what's most important, what data is most important to collect, to demonstrate to yourselves as a company, to investors, and to stakeholders. And, how does that story change as the company evolves? So definitely interested in the hardware and the software side. So can you describe to our audience what you're doing at Nanowear and the SimpleSense? And it's a wearable continuous monitor. Just describe that in more detail.
Yeah, here we go. Nanowear is, we're a New York-based healthcare at home remote diagnostics or connected care platform. And we're built on our core invention from advanced material sensors that feeds this very unique data set that we ultimately run machine learning on. But that ground floor of our technology is what we call cloth nanotechnology. So if you can see this in the screen, it's just a standard sort of piece of fabric that you would see if you were touching it in person. But if you touch the surface area of the cloth, it feels felty or suede-like underneath your fingertips, and that's you feeling billions of vertically standing sensors or nanosensors per centimeter of surface area. And not to get too deep into the actual engineering and physics of it, but all of those billions of touch points on your skin enable a much higher sort of signal to noise ratio of varying different raw biomarkers that can be detected off the skin. So acoustic signals, electrical signals, bioimpedance signals. And because we can do all of that time synchronously, there's a lot of derivatives based on where we're capturing sensors that derive some more derived biomarkers. So we're really proud to say this is the first cloth that FDA has 510K cleared in the world for capture and transmission of essential performance biomarkers. But as you had mentioned on the evolution of what we were doing with that, we started with this cloth, knew it was giving fantastic data, and we didn't necessarily know the right place to start in building a business. I think most entrepreneurs in the tech world, or even medtech or healthcare, I think identify a problem and build the tech to sort of solve it. We were kind of the opposite. And the reason for that is another family affair. This was actually our co-founder's life's work invention. And our co-founder is a 40-plus year academic researcher, Dr. Venk Varadan, who is my father. And so he did a lot of defense-related applications for many years before the word nanotechnology was even created. He and my mother both taught at Penn State University, which is where me and my siblings grew up. As well as the University of Arkansas. And my father's research was mostly focused on expanding surface area in a footprint where you can't expand area, but getting signal detection. So if you think about hard to detect environments, a submarine under 30 meters of sea level, you can't expand the size of the hull of the submarine where the sonar detectors are, right? But after you get under a certain depth with the pressure, sonar detection from deeper depths start to become untraceable between each other. You don't know if that detection is from a whale, a school of fish, a geyser, or a Russian sub, right? And so, he would lace the hull with these nanosensors, right, that could start to filter out every millisecond those varying differences in the reverberations of different sonar signatures. Did the same thing with high altitude planes. And then kind of thought that the human body is kind of the same hard to detect environment and applied that same strategy.
And can you describe what biomarkers you're sensing with your wearable device?
Yeah, so again, depending on trying to figure out what you're looking for in the application. In our current device and product, which I'm sure we'll talk about how we got there, our nanosensor technology in the orientation that it has, it's sort of a shoulder sash. It goes over your right shoulder. And think of it sort of replacing the stethoscope, the multi-channel Holter monitor, lung volume, breaths per minute, pulse ox, activity, movement, posture, and continuous systemic hemodynamics or blood pressure. So you're replacing all of those first-line diagnostic tools in a time-synchronous manner. And we can replace all those tools through the raw metrics that we can capture: electrical signals, bioimpedance signals, acoustic signals, and really give a time synchronous cardiopulmonary assessment in that regard. All of those tools I mentioned, the stethoscope, the blood pressure cuff, even the pulse ox, for example, these tools are sort of applied when you go see your doctor, even if you're healthy or you're very sick. They're applied for 30 seconds at a point of time. The human body and the mind sort of know that they're being monitored, and you result in aspects of white coat syndrome, right? So our thesis was always, can we do this in a home-based solution where participants of a trial or patients in general are sort of living their natural life, and we're getting sort of much more than 30 seconds of data, about 45 minutes of data. So after that first minute or two, they throw this comfortable sort of sash on that they can kind of go about doing what their normal sort of course of routine was on the couch or in their bed or in the kitchen or what have you. And get a real cardiopulmonary assessment continuously, having all of those metrics. It'd kind of be 7 different tools strapped onto you that are all talking to the same backend system. We do that with just our cloth and our device.
Got it. Yeah. So we're jumping ahead, but the biomarkers. So there's 85 different biomarkers. It sounds, as of a recent recording that I was doing research on leading up to this interview. I'm sure there's more now, and a couple derivatives of those 85. But it's a wearable device that's used in home. Just walk us through the use case. Is it once a day, 3 times a day? And what are the patients again?
Yeah, good question. I'm not punting on your question. The answer is it does depend. We are focused on a patient population that is kind of at the lower end of regression in structural cardiology diagnosis. So unfortunately, when a patient is diagnosed with a structural heart issue, sadly, they're on kind of a one-way regression. Andy, we can hold them at certain spots with different therapeutics and different lifestyle modifications, what have you. But ultimately, they're probably going to need some sort of procedure or an implantable device, or in worst cases, extending that time for a heart transplant to be available. And what's missing along that entire journey of that patient is recurrent cardiopulmonary assessments. I use the word pulmonary because that's important to understand here. Patients with heart failure or other structural heart diseases, you can't just look at the heart in a vacuum. The heart and the lungs, the central vascular and the hemodynamic system are very intricately linked. And if you're not looking at all of those sort of biomarkers from each of those contiguous systems at the same time, you're probably missing the picture of what that individual patient's risk is. The human body compensates for deficiencies in many amazing ways, but also very individualized ways. So if you and I went in and got our blood pressure, let's assume we were the exact same age, the exact same height, the exact same ethnicity, exact same BMI, and your blood pressure said 130/90 and mine said 130/90, there is no way we could say that we have the exact same vascular health based on that one number in time. You have to sort of interpret that with all the other biomarkers across the cardiopulmonary or heart, lung, central vascular, and hemodynamic system. And that's where I think our product gives a very unique insight along that structural heart journey, to give the providers that do those implantable devices or those procedures or those transplants, and the end users that support them, the cardiologists, the interventionalists, and obviously the patients, a more trended understanding of when is that procedure really needed. Can we get them in before it's too late? And can we get them off of it after it's already been successful? A lot of blind spots along that journey that we're hoping to and starting to prove in early days.
You're not at the point necessarily where you're preventing, cardiovascular disease. What you're proposing, at least for the killer app right now, is preventing acute, procedures needed, and you're kind of projecting when you might need to intervene earlier for these patients that are already heading down that road. So I guess just for our audience, Venk, just describe in detail the value that, where is the value here? I mean, you're going to have to pay for this product, and eventually these procedures need to happen. Like, what trials have you run, and what's your main value sort of proposition here?
Yeah, I guess the latter part, we've done a slew of clinical studies across some great academic institutions across the country. The most notable being a ongoing study in patients with diagnosed heart failure, both systolic and diastolic heart failure. And that is being led at Penn State University or Penn State Health by a PI named Dr. John Boehmer. And then our probably second one that's worthwhile is a continuous blood pressure, intermittent blood pressure in the ability to diagnose and understand differences in hypertension levels. So that was a study we just completed this year in 8 different locations across the U.S., the New York metro area, 5 boroughs, Westchester County, North Jersey, Central Pennsylvania, Eastern Pennsylvania, and suburban Atlanta, Georgia. The important thing about both of those studies is that we're probably jumping ahead, but we received FDA clearances, several of them, from the cloth through the device, through the layered sort of end-to-end software platform that sits on top of it. But we do not have clearances for the data-driven diagnostics that we're talking about. So this gets into the value question that you were discussing. A machine learning-based diagnostic utilizing all of those 85 biomarkers that we talked about across the heart, lung, central vascular, and hemodynamic system. We are using that data inputs, very clean, high signal to noise ratio, but a lot of it every millisecond over that 45 minutes or an hour. And deriving sort of calculations against gold standard devices to give a non-invasive at-home tool for potentially diagnosing hypertension, worsening heart failure, other aspects of structural heart. That's really the value that we can drive at home, because these procedures or this type of diagnosis is only able to be done with something invasive in a hospital. So an A line in your arm, right, for continuous blood pressure, or a Swan Ganz through your groin that's going into your right heart, that's doing a right heart catheterization for another hemodynamic, like cardiac output, pulmonary arterial pressure.
Is that like a CardioMEMS type product?
That's one aspect, right? So CardioMEMS would do fractionally sort of what we are potentially able to determine. So pulmonary arterial pressure is obviously a big hemodynamic metric that CardioMEMS targets with their sort of implantable device, very sleek solution. But what if we can sort of support that in a non-invasive way, either before CardioMEMS is put in, or even potentially afterwards? We don't look at ourselves really as a competitor to these types of products. We look at ourselves as more of a complement along that journey, before that procedure or implant is needed. I'd say a company like CardioMEMS would probably want this more upstream to understand what patients are more viable for their product downstream, as opposed to right now, which is kind of, we think that this will work here. And unfortunately, that's what we're doing in structural heart.
So Venk, our audience is comprised of, hardware developers, leaders in the medtech space, as well as significant, work in software algorithm space, right? So as you formed Nanowear, you mentioned, you started with the cloth, kind of teased out generally like what the product would look like. And pretty quickly, there was this whole algorithm piece and machine learning, AI. Describe the AI ML algorithms at a high level first, and then maybe talk a little bit about like your company structure and how you're actually doing that.
It's been a long ride, and we've got a lot more to do when you start with cloth, hardware, mobile software, cloud software, and then obviously AI ML. But I guess before just jumping into the AI ML, our goal from the beginning, even though we really didn't understand how we were going to get there, that came over time, was really understanding the data quality from our cloth is just superior to what else is out there. And because the data quality is so superior from a raw signal standpoint, and we get a lot of these different biomarkers continuously, we can really do something from a data standpoint that nobody else can. And that's really the vision that we had, that ultimately people are going to buy our product or our services because of the data and the insights we can give from that. And that's really done by machine learning. We can call it AI. I really don't like that term. I've personally never really liked it in healthcare. I think it's probably applicable for static data, right? So image analysis, natural language processing, or speech recognition. Not only are the AI engines pretty sophisticated with that, but also regulatory bodies are okay with that as well. A radiological scan of your lungs, you can look at millions of them, and AI can sort of detect things. We're talking about cardiopulmonary dynamic data. Your blood pressure changes every second. Your cardiac output will change, right? And so it's a little bit trickier there. So when we think about ML in healthcare, these are not adaptive algorithms, right? We will prove them in both the training and then a validation set in our clinical studies. Take that through FDA, work with them on the iterations, stuff like that. And then take it also in parallel through the peer review community, right? Because in healthcare, FDA clearances don't just drive adoption. You need good, sound peer review publications against gold standard devices. So we fix our algorithm, Andy, and then we put it into the field. If we wanted to make an update to that based on more data, pending on the clearance with FDA, that could be a letter to file, or you're redoing a new 510K. So it's not like traditional AI that gets smarter over time with real world evidence. That will be very, I don't know if that's coming anytime soon in healthcare, but because what happens if the machine's wrong? Who's liable? Right?
So you're maturing your algorithm as you get more data through these studies, and eventually you're going to submit probably your first sort of ML software release on your platform that says you're trying. I guess, what are you trying to claim? What do you think will be your first claim with this machine learning algorithm that's running on your platform?
Yeah, the first one we're hoping for is sort of systemic hemodynamics. Most of this is around hemodynamic detection, right? Which really can only be done invasively by sending lines into the artery or to the central veins, right? If we can do that non-invasively, that's a real value driver. And the reason we know we can do it is that all of our inputs, whether that's electrocardiographs, whether that's lung volume, breaths per minute, acoustic sounds of your heart, the different frequency levels, the loudness of them, these all have known associations to changes in hemodynamics, right? By literature over the last 40 years. So we know our scientific approach is sound, but because it's ML, you need a lot of data to prove that. And so the beauty is of our SASH, we can calculate all of that from a millisecond standpoint. But the first one that we are hoping to get proved would be for intermittent or continuous blood pressure throughout that 45-minute or 1 hour recording, with the ability to diagnose hypertension. So a lot of the continuous non-invasive monitors that are doing blood pressure, and there are a good amount out there on both the arm as well as the wrist, they follow a similar scientific principle, whether it's occlusion of the blood, you're cutting off the blood and then opening it, and then listening to the noise, standard old 100-year-old process of blood pressure, or a mathematical relationship called pulse wave transit time. We are doing something completely different. We're calculating blood pressure across the aorta with all of those inputs that we measured. So a true systemic hemodynamic measurement, and then we would want to extend that to additional hemodynamic measurements. So as we mentioned, cardiac output, pulmonary arterial pressure, cardiac power output, which we're also starting validation on at a renowned site in the US, actually any week now. We just received IRB approval from that.
You're initially said you're going for continuous blood pressure to diagnose, hypertension. I mean, I thought you were saying that these patients are already, sick and they're on their way to surgery. So, don't they already have hypertension? Or is this just a more accurate measure of it and watching it sort of decay? And that's kind of your biomarker.
It's kind of, think of it this way, in whichever clearance we get is not what's solving the entire issue. It's another step that's getting more of an understanding of the cardiopulmonary complex and the heart-lung central vascular and hemodynamic system. The more we understand of that individual's relationship. So again, it's not just the blood pressure we're looking at with all these patients, right? It's the blood pressure now plus their heart rate variability from the electrocardiographs, their lung volume decreasing or increasing, plus their breaths per minute, plus their activity, movement, posture, plus their heart sounds. Heart failure patients have an S3 murmur that pops up. We have healthy patients, we just have two murmurs, the S1, S2, the lub-dub sound of your heart, but heart failure patients have an extra one. So we're combining all of those things together. And then when you can add cardiac output, pulmonary arterial, all these things in a sort of algorithmic soup is where you're going to get the best understanding of a risk signature. If you just looked at one or two of those metrics, it's going to be very difficult to build an association specifically with a disease as complicated as a structural heart disorder. We all kind of get there in a different way. There's so many comorbidities that lead to it. It's not just hypertension, as an example.
No, I mean, as you're describing your product, I'm thinking like, what is your moat? And it sounds like your moat is a combination of things. I mean, obviously the core nanotechnology that was developed over decades, that's one piece. And, competition is going to have probably sensors all over the body, and that's not what somebody wants to use. And an Apple Watch can only kind of collect so much data, I suppose. Although there are some sort of digital exhaust biomarkers out there that may be able to help, but that's kind of way far out there, I would think. Plus, all the algorithm work that you're doing. So, Venk, for our audience, and we do talk to a lot of companies, globals and startups that are similar structure to you, where they're developing some hardware, maybe it's a bioelectronic therapy or something like that, or a global company that's adding connectivity to things like blood collection or traditionally purely mechanical components. Just talk to us a little bit more about your software team. I mean, these algorithms that you're developing, this is big data. I think, petabytes might have been the term I read in one of your papers. So, what does your team look like? When did you decide to kind of start building that team, and what did it look like then, and what does it look like now?
This is probably the part of our journey as a startup that makes me smile the most and probably makes me the most proud. We're still a tiny team. We're under 30 people. Like I said, 7 years in, we just launched commercially this year. We don't have a sales and marketing team yet. We're very product R&D and clinical focused. And that includes and sort of pervades hardware, the advanced materials, the hardware, the firmware, the mobile server-based software, and then ultimately ML. So when we constructed the team, the original 7 of us was myself and our co-founder, Dr. Venk Varadan, 4 of his former master's and PhD students, and then a good friend of a longtime colleague of mine in the finance world who came on with me to start the business development and sort of strategy, kind of just run the front office with me. He's still an advisor to the company, Reggie Hall. But the 4 founding engineers were sort of my first sell in building the team. I had to sort of, when my father sort of approached me with this idea, my multivariable calculus and BME all kind of came back all at once after 15 years of kind of me keeping that dormant. I called up his 4 guys and I said, my father never really had an ambition of potentially starting a company. He's an academic, right? He wanted to publish and one day speak in Stockholm, right? Which is still his goal, right? Whereas I kind of had more of the business minded sense, like, let's build something, a for-profit business out of this that can also save lives, right? Sort of bridging that altruism with capitalism, which I think all of us jump into healthcare in particular with. But it was to convince those guys, hey, the degree is always going to be there for you, but we've got an opportunity to start something really special here. And this was back in 2014 when the word wearable was popping off the charts, as you can imagine. But we kind of had a long-standing strategy discussion for the first 6 to 12 months on what do we want to be and what is our core value that we can give in differentiating. And ultimately, it was always going to be on the software and ML side. We didn't have those capabilities in-house then. This was mostly hardware, materials, and BME. So what we tasked our current CTO, Prashant Shamkumar, and Mauli Ramasamy did a little bit. He's our head of product as well. But Prashant really just took this upon himself, just started learning code from 7 years ago, and I would say he's one of the best data scientists that you can see in the market today. And it's because he understands our fire hose of data better than anyone else. You can be ML and AI and look at all these different data sets and just comb them through and come up with some association and publish on it. It's great, right? It's tough to do in healthcare. When you talk about the moats that we build, it's not only the patents on this and the patents on the product and the design, but it's also an understanding of how to optimize the data that's off the body, and that comes from firmware all the way to data-driven code. So Prashant really manages that part of our business, and his team. And then on the software side, we were fortunate to, and I was courting this gentleman, Zach Taylor, for 4 years before I could convince him to join us. But he's been a good friend of the company. I actually grew up with him. He was one of those first software PhDs that dropped out of high school and just started coding in the 90s. Moved to Boston, moved to San Francisco. Been at a slew of different companies, from MedTech to mostly consumer startups. Had a slew of exits as well. It's huge, Andy. You bring up the best point. The reason I wanted Zach forever was because healthcare at home was, on the digital health side, either took two approaches. You approached it as a med device company and you were laser focused on safety and efficacy, or you took it from the health and wellness side and you were really focused on usability. And if you did this, you were ignoring this, or if you did this, you were ignoring this. And that's where I think a lot of the Gen 1 and Gen 2 companies kind of failed in driving mass adoption, because they could never really drive both. And so Zach, with that experience, really brought in a usability aspect and a customer development aspect, where he would kind of just sit with our KOLs across the country and across the user base, understand all the differences on how everybody uses technology. The sad thing, or maybe good thing about healthcare is that there isn't a single clinic that works the same way, right? Some they have different staff, they have different people. Sometimes the receptionist is doing all the org work. Sometimes the physician is. It's very different from Joplin, Missouri to Beverly Hills to Manhattan. So if you build one solution with Mayo Clinic and think you can just disperse it across all the clinics out there, it's probably not going to be understood by everybody or adopted by everybody who isn't used to that same workflow or that same database. So Zach did a great job building our software stack to be customizable for the end user, and those two really have been critical to our success, and the people that report to them, obviously.
Yeah, I just want to pause on that real quick. One of the themes at KeyTech we've been talking about for years is, it's important to have technical team members out in the field interviewing your customers, your KOLs, because they're going to turn around and immediately start coding early prototypes and bringing that back to that person you have a relationship with, rather than having someone who maybe doesn't understand software and is kind of just thinking about just the workflow. Like there's questions you come up with that a software developer can think of, and maybe it's like the 10 different ways to prompt something, or how are you going to view this data, that somebody who isn't skilled in software development is not going to be able to think of on the fly. So it's kind of just a more efficient way to gather market data. So it sounds like that was, critical to building the bones of the cloud-based, algorithm work that you're implementing.
You got to do it leanly, Andy. I mean, as a startup, I think it's important, and I don't want to belittle what these guys and girls did on our team. There was a pushed mandate to understand as much as possible, and we didn't have a field services team. So I really commend them on how much they understood that all of this upfront work, as tedious as it was, with different personalities all over the place, was something we pushed from the top down. And I think that we're seeing the fruits of that labor from years ago.
So just today, you mentioned you have about a 30-person company. How many people are doing like the machine learning kind of algorithm and data management side? Is that about half the three? Okay. We've talked a lot about data, and it sounds like this is an ever evolving story, but when you started the company, it seemed like you were pretty confident that the tech worked and that you could create some sort of wearable that would gather the data. But I'm picturing 7 years ago, you're getting some revenue from an American in Hollywood, and you're saying, let's just go all in on this thing. Like, I guess just describe to our audience, what data were you really trying to capture? I don't know, in the first year, I guess maybe year and a half, to like convince you, the founder CEO, that like this is actually something that has legs. And I guess I say you because I get the impression that you've kind of just been gathering money from friends, recruiting friends and family and things like that. But eventually, I'm sure you had to. We'll talk about investor pitches and things in a minute. But I guess what were you specifically looking for to convince yourself that you're going to devote your life to this?
And I think the first thing we decided was we are going to be a healthcare company. When we made that decision, as opposed to, are we going to work with athletes in fitness? Are we going to be on the consumer side? Well, time will tell whether the business decision was right, but I didn't want to start competing with the Apples of the world, and Nike was diving in and Under Armour was diving in there. And there were some consumer wearables that were really well funded at the time. And we just felt that differentiation we had, the moats that we had with this tech was more suited for healthcare. Investors hated that, which we'll talk about in a second, as you can imagine. But I felt like until we got an FDA clearance on the cloth, this was not going to be really taken seriously in the world of FDA. I hadn't even really thought of a business model, which we'll talk about. I have a funny story about that with one of our first investors. We just went heads down after the first 6 months to get a clearance for the cloth on multi-channel electrocardiographs and sort of pulmonary metrics, so breaths per minute and derivation. So we got that clearance in 2016, but started working with FDA as early in 2015 on that. And that was our first sort of introduction to the regulatory bodies. And really, obviously pre-pandemic, we were down in DC, 11 times over that discussion because FDA had never seen this cloth before. And we had to do some very unique sort of safety and efficacy characterizations, given that there wasn't really an analog to this. That was really the goal that I set out with, like, until we get this clearance, people aren't even going to take anything we say from a business model standpoint seriously, even though I didn't really understand the business model back then either.
Yeah, real quick on that. I mean, you got clearance. Were you pursuing revenue with that clearance as a way to sort of justify, that activity or to show investors? Or was it just like, okay, we checked that box. Now let's start building this thing?
I would love to say that there was an idea of collecting revenue with it. The answer was no. And again, something investors hated. It to me, it had to be a stepwise progression on what we could do that was different than what was out there. But until we sort of proved that we are medical grade, that would have been very challenging to bring in more capital for the next phase, right? You have to be careful with this to always do ongoing and everlasting science projects, right? But we did not believe that just an electrocardiograph and lung monitor clearance was going to be sufficient to drive revenue. And we didn't know if we were 24/7 use case, if we were 1 hour. We hadn't tested it enough in the field from a real world evidence standpoint. But we were already starting to have ambitions and technological sort of perspective on how we could help for heart failure patients or structural heart patients. And just an electrocardiograph and lungs would not have aided in that regard. So, long-winded answer to your question, it was stepwise. It was not pushed for revenue, which is another thing that investors used to slap me around on. But
okay, so you got the core wearable cleared, or the cloth, or was it the cloth and the wearable?
it was actually a different form factor. But yes, the core of the 2,000-page submission, 1,800 of it was on the cloth. But the design was actually a tank top for men and a bra for women. Which is no longer our device form factor, which is a funny story because we got that clearance. We said we want to add some more features to this that would enable it to start getting in the world of heart failure. And end users were like, I love this idea of a tank top for men and a bra for women, but I don't know how many 6'5", 300-pound men are coming in this week, or how many 32A cup sizes are coming in this week. And it's just, one of those things that hits you on the head, knowing you're going to have a giant inventory management problem. And so we knew we had to go gender neutral, size adjustable. I hate the word pivot. I never use that word in our company. But we had to adjust the design and the actual form factor. Did that really adjust the hardware and the material science? No, not at all. But that alone is a trickier thing than just adjusting code and finding bugs in code. My software team's going to hate me for saying that, because I know that that's not the easy part. But rejigging a vest or the sash, took some time. So that was also something that folks don't like funding. Hardware reiterations, right?
So when did you start taking on investor money?
We were funded as early as late 2014, early 2015, both institutional and angel investors. And as a med tech or digital health company, you're pretty much raising capital every day that you wake up. When you're a founder CEO, you close a round, you're still talking about the next one already. So we have been, I'd say, fairly efficient with capital. I don't know what I'm allowed to disclose here, but we've raised under 20 to date over 7 years, and reached commercial launch, which I think most companies in our space have raised, even if they're doing fractionally what we're doing, have raised 50 to 60 at minimum to get there. So I'm really proud of the efficiencies that the team has done. Management owns a lot of the company, which makes our stock value, very high, as opposed to some bigger digital health companies. Yeah, we've been sort of taking capital all day, but I'll tell you, one of our first institutional board meetings asked the exact same question you did, and I'll leave them nameless for now, but they said, all right, you think you're going to get this FDA clearance in a year. It took 18 months, 20 months as opposed to a year. What are you going to do after that? And show me your revenue model. I'm like, not ready to do that yet. I don't know. And I remember one of the partners at the table looking at me like I was the biggest fool. And why did we write this guy a check? And he's telling us he doesn't know what his business is yet. But I didn't know what the model was. I didn't want to be an arrhythmia company. I didn't want to just be an ECG company. That was crowded. I didn't want to be a consumer company. That was crowded. And I was trying to really learn and be a student of the case studies that this would unfold. Call me a little bit crazy, but the first company to market in a new field rarely becomes the standard of care, right? There was Lycos, there was Yahoo, there was Excite well before there was Google, right? There were a lot of PC companies well before there were Apple. So
Yeah, so question for you. We haven't talked really much about the patients. So what have you learned from the patients that you've then reflected in the product as it stands today? You mentioned the sizing, that's an obvious one, but I mean, what are the patients saying?
number one, they're not going to wear it all day. So, we think our thing's super comfortable, but it is more cumbersome than putting on a watch or putting on a patch. So one of the first things we learned from our patients is we're not going to do a 24/7 use case. Even though you could probably get the most benefit from that, Andy, you got to bridge in that usability and compliance aspect too. So part of that was also our understanding in parallel of the data quality we were getting. So when we were doing our heart failure study, which we kicked off in 2017, I believe, we were asking patients to wear our sash for 12 hours a day for 90 days straight. 2 hours before bed, overnight, 2 hours in the morning. We didn't have horrible compliance issues. And that's simply because these patients are pretty sick, right? They'll try anything at this point. They're waking up in the middle of the night, maybe once a month or once a quarter, and their lungs have filled up with fluid and they can't breathe. They feel like they're drowning, right, from heart failure. So our compliance there was pretty good. But what we realized through that study and having 20 or so patients complete that first phase in feasibility of that really long data set, right, where we had petabytes of data, as we said, right? I mean, we were getting almost a gig per patient per day over 90 days in raw data. We realized that because we're kind of longitudinally trending these patients, that we could understand the same characterization and picture of that sort of trend and regression, with just a 45 minutes to an hour recording on a daily basis versus 12 hours. And then we understood in talking to both our users and our patients, if you're a class 2 heart failure patient versus a class 4, you probably don't need to record as often, right? So we leave that to the discretion of the heart failure patient. But patients really liked the aspect of being able to deploy it at home. And then when we said you only need to wear it for 45 minutes to an hour, they got really excited. And while it's still an ask on patients, when they understand, hey, you're going to spend 45 minutes just sitting on the subway or sitting on the 405 to get to your doctor's office, okay? And when you get there, you're going to be sitting in the waiting room and you're going to get these 30-second measurements here, and it's likely going to be wrong. Or it's talking to disparate devices, back end, so you're not getting the signature. So I think now patients are kind of more motivated in this sort of category that we're starting with to understand the value. And we got to be honest, Andy, we got lucky with COVID, with the pandemic hitting. We're the first to admit that. There wasn't a put. We were kind of doing the same thing, and the clinics or the end users of physicians didn't really care, right? Because the patients had no choice; they had to come in, right? Now the patients have a choice, and there's a focus on giving the patients what they want, right? And if you see what FDA commissioner is saying, CMS, everybody, healthcare at home is the focus over the next 5 to 10 years. So I think that sort of industry shift also really helped the patients understand, I'd much rather do this.
Yeah, you mentioned in our warm-up call a couple of weeks ago about the line of nurses in a regional hospital are gone and they're never coming back. And so just all the more reason why all these devices are being launched in the home.
It's a bigger issue than we're willing to admit right now, and especially with structural heart. And again, I'm not picking on geographies. We're all American, and we've got sick hearts everywhere. But as you can imagine, the driver of healthcare costs are people that don't have the recurrent care, right? And that's our middle class or lower socioeconomic class, which is the majority of our country. And a lot of them live in rural areas, right? That are maybe 50 miles away from the nearest academic center at minimum, right? Let alone their community hospital center, which again doesn't have the staff or the equipment to manage these patients, even if they did come in for an acute failure or they were trying to stay on top of it and manage those recurring assessments. There's really nothing for them, right? So now if you can kind of work with these companies who have digital teams, they can manage patients from Mississippi to Washington to New York to Maine, and they don't need physical people on the ground. So I think that's another industry win that, again, I'm not happy about. I'm not happy that nurses have quit across the country, but I understand why they did. And this is now a technological gap that can fill that need to address. Because even now, when we're talking, I'm sitting here in New York, the governor's talking about the triple virus that's out there. It's RSV, it's COVID, and it's the flu hitting. Even here, we're worried about if this kind of becomes a big deal, like in rural parts of the state, do we have the staffing to manage, from a nurse standpoint, do we have the staffing to manage these patients when they come in with acute illnesses? So this is an issue that I don't think is going away. I don't think this is a near term, everyone's jumping back into school here.
Yeah, the answer is no. I mean, my wife works in the ER every night, and there aren't enough nurses to staff empty ER ED rooms. So she ends up treating patients in the waiting room, kind of like walking around an airport asking people, what's wrong, because there's not enough nursing to support them actually in the ED room. So yeah, that's just one anecdote. So I was gonna kind of just cut to a couple closing question. Actually, one main closing question to close this out. And then for those of you listening this far into the podcast, in this episode, we are going to record a few additional bonus questions related to working with investors. So this will be the last question for the general audience. So Venk, you've been working on this for many years now. If you could go back and change one thing that you've done, knowing what you know now, what would it be? It could be product, it could be hiring, it could be trial design, it could be fundraising. I don't know. Just what would you do differently?
There's probably a million things. I think any honest entrepreneur, first-time founder would say that there were things I did last week, which I wish I would have done differently. If I had to pick one aspect, Andy, it would have been to keep my ears open as they are now, my ears and eyes open as they are now in my first 12 to 18 months. And what I mean by that is that I think every first-time founder, particularly in healthcare, which is very complicated. We're not making food delivery apps here, right? Or something like that. You really, really need to humble yourself of what you don't know. And I think any first-time founder or CEO that starts a business, we are probably diagnosably crazy or insane because we believe in our heart and our minds that this is broken, we can fix it, right? And we can fix it faster than everybody tells us we can. Anyone who says don't get into that, that's stupid, that fuels us further, right? um but with that fuel, exactly, but with that fuel, you do, there's a natural inclination to kind of look around and be like, I don't want to listen to this advice because they're looking at this conservatively. They would have never done this. They don't have this tech. They don't know anything, right? I think I've always been a learner, so I don't think my complex was that bad in that regard. I don't believe I am some brilliant person. I have to surround myself with people, both on the team and at the board and at the advisory level, that sort of know more. But I don't think I was as appreciative as I was until understanding what the real goal of building a business is. Because until you've done it, you haven't done it, right? Until you've launched a product commercially in the market, you haven't done it, right? And particularly in healthcare, which is a challenging place, there's all types of things to consider, from quality systems to reimbursement to regulatory to everything like that. So that would be my number one lesson for anyone diving in. Like, never stop being a sponge, but you have to start being a sponge from the very beginning and soak in everything. Even if it's going through your filter and you're discussing and you're like, I'm going to dismiss that, you still got to listen because it's going to help shape the strategy going forward. I wish I did more of that in the first year.
You don't want to find out that maybe what you're pursuing could fail. And so and there's like definitely this mentality of like, ignore the naysayers, ignore your competition, and just focus on your mission and, work hard and good thing, make your own luck kind of thing. So I can see how that would happen. I guess what insight maybe did you ignore? Do you think that maybe you should have taken that advice sooner?
I don't regret not understanding my commercial model just sitting where we are today, Andy, because I think we have found the right nerve in the market that, again, kind of takes advantage of these industry wins. We couldn't have predicted a pandemic was hitting in 2014, 2015, that it would have hit a year or two before we were launching commercially, right? I would say that a better understanding of the commercial aspect of the business is something I personally should have spent more time on in the first year, in the second year, really understanding the different stakeholders in the conundrum. It's not just patient and physician. If it was, that would be pretty easy, right? Or easier. Let me take that back. If it was, it would be easier, right? You've got payers, you've got government, you've got many other stakeholders in the conundrum in healthcare, and they all have to be weaved into your business model, right? If you're only thinking about a few of them, as a good friend from a large cap device company says, it's very easy to get 2 or 3 of those right with your model. It's very hard to get all 5 of them right. And that's just something I didn't know when I started. And if somebody had really hit me across the head in the first 12 months and say, these are your 5 stakeholders, your model has to address all of them equally in the current environment, and then it has to be ready to be flexible when one of those might change, reimbursement changes, or something like that, because it is fluid in that regard. So it's not maybe as specific as you were looking for, but
I think that's great. I mean, I was just judging the Johns Hopkins graduate bioengineering design program earlier this week, and I don't envy startup entrepreneurs, particularly in the med device space. They're presenting these case studies, and does your tech work? Will users actually use it? Who's the payer? What's the business model? What's your total addressable market? There's so many things you need to balance, and it's never perfect from the start. So you do have to be crazy to sort of jump into it. And but I think the feedback on, like, at the end of the day, like, who are the stakeholders, and you have to kind of meet them today or a year from now, and then 3 years from now. I mean, I think that's pretty wise advice for, we meet with a lot of, here at KeyTech, a lot of startup companies that are kind of in love with their technology and they know the market's out there. But, I think we try to ask these tough questions early on to evaluate whether we should work with this entrepreneur. So even this insight here, we might use it in the next couple of weeks, even. Like, tell us a little bit more about your business model.
I think, Andy, what you're getting at is obviously also through the lens of an investor or an acquirer or a public market investor when you want to go public. There are so many different pockets of risk to your company. It's not just tech. It's not just regulatory. It's not just business model. It's not just reimbursement. It's not just personnel. You have to be able to, if you chalk off 4 of those, but there's still so much risk in this other aspect, are you going to be able to close your Series A in this market? I don't think you will. That was one of the things I wish I had sort of had my eyes and ears open more to in that regard.
Thank you so much for coming on MedTech Speed to Data. Glad you came on, and wish you best of luck in the market here in the coming years. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks, KeyTech, for having me.
Everybody, until next time, thanks. Andy Rogers, signing off. See you later.
Thanks for tuning in to MedTech Speed to Data, a KeyTech podcast. Join us each month for more ways to get the right data faster to inform critical decisions. Find additional resources on our website, keytechinc.com. If you like this episode, don't forget to subscribe, and please leave a review on iTunes whenever you listen. Thanks.